Welcome to the Tank Podcast. In this week's episode, Thomas Roueché speaks to Nils Gilman, author of the social science classic Mandarins of the Future and director of the Berggruen Institute, where he's working to reframe our planetary crisis.
I guess I wanted to ask you just a bit about your background, how you came to Berggruen, and also particularly about your work, Mandarins of the Future, like how that informs where you are now.
Well, let me give you a brief career trajectory. So I did the PhD in history, which produced the Mandarins of the Future book. And then I finished that 25 years ago, the PhD. And I've never been an academic, at least I've taught occasionally at universities, sort of moonlighting, but I've never had an academic appointment. I spent the first 6.5 years of my career working in tech, actually. And then I spent another 7-year chunk doing consulting work for what are known as 3-letter agencies in the United States. And this was sort of late global war on terror, early Obama years sort of period. Then I spent 4 years working as a senior administrator at Berkeley. I was the chief of staff to the chancellor there, which gave me a lot of experience about how big bureaucracies do and don't work. And in some ways, it was quite important for my thinking about the importance of getting decision rights allocated to the proper level or zone within a multi-scalar decision hierarchy, because the great frustration of that job really was that we were held responsible for things we were not given authority over. Or we were held responsible for the results of processes over which we had no authority. And that was one of the most infuriating and frustrating episodes in my entire life, frankly, not just career. And so when that period ended, I looked around for a variety of different jobs, and this opportunity emerged in the spring of 2017. But when I met Nicolas, I asked him one particular question, which was, what do you want this place to be or have been or be remembered as 50 years from now? Which is basically a legacy question. I mean, this is a legacy project for him. And he gave me the most extraordinary answer, which kind of just blew my mind, actually. And I've heard him give similar answers to similar questions in the past, since then several times. So I think this is his sincere answer. He said, I want Berggruen to be the place where the most interesting people around were asking the most interesting questions of the time. And what's so remarkable about that as an answer is you think about most rich people who sponsor ideas, whether it's giving money to a university program or funding a think tank or whatever it may be. They usually have some pretty idée fixe about what it is they want to do, right? I mean, maybe they want to save orphan cats, or they want to, promote, tax cuts for rich people, whatever it is they want to do, right? They usually have some fixed idea. Maybe it's a methodology, like the Santa Fe Institute. They want to promote complexity science, right? This is like a completely open-ended thing that Nicolas has. I mean, he has got a nose for, the reason he got to be as successful as he is, he's got a real nose for like what issues matter at any given time, to put it in somewhat glib terms, Hegelian terms. He has a nose for where Geist is hanging out. And then he's really just interested in exploring what the contours of that are. And so for me, this looked like a really interesting opportunity. He wanted to basically build a research program. The point at which I joined was in spring of 2017, and that was really an inflection point for the Institute, because the first 7 years of the Institute, we had basically been a convening organization predicated on the assumption that there were big governance challenges in the world, and then there were people who had a lot of good ideas about how to do governance. We just needed to get those two things together, and then good things would happen. And then, to make a long story short, 2016 happened, and Brexit, Trump, and sort of the realization that the institutional infrastructure of our governance was much more deeply broken than I think the initial presumptions of the first years of the Institute were. And so they decided they wanted to build a research program to ask fundamental questions about, not just find people who had good ideas, but actually originate ideas and to develop ideas internally. And so that's what I was brought in to do. I mean, what I've done over my career is build research organizations, essentially. Most of what I've done in the last 20 odd years has been about that. And I've done that in the private sector, for software companies, and for for consulting firms. I've done that at a university. I've done that here. So that's kind of where my background is. Now, specifically about Mandarins of the Future, there's some people have noted that the argument I made, and I should say I was a young man when I wrote that, I was in my 20s, was a pretty acerbic take on the kind of technocratic ambitions of mid-century American liberals. Although by the time I finished writing it and finished writing the book, I'd become much more sympathetic to kind of the perspectives that they were coming towards, because I saw, once I'd really gotten deep into the literature, that the kinds of oppositions that they were facing were in many cases, just as epistemologically hubristic as they were, but even more politically wrong-headed in some ways. And so even by the time I published that book, while I had a lot of choice things to say about people like Walt Rostow and Lucien Pai, I had a lot more sympathy with other people. And even this kind of glib line that I have about Fukuyama in the end of the book, where, he sort of positions himself as the kind of Lukács relative to modernization theory, where Lukács was to Marxism, right? Where he discovers this Hegelian substrate that the practitioners of contemporary Marxism or modernization theory probably had no idea about, right? And so and I remember saying something like that in the final chapter of the book. I didn't know Frank at the time, and I found out a couple of years later he was teaching the book, and I was like, "Ooh, I hope he wasn't insulted." So I actually reached out to him. This was probably around 2007 or 8. And we've been friends since then, actually. So what's changed, I think, is that, this is maybe a version of Keynes's famous line about, when the facts changed, I changed my mind. What do you do, sir? Right? The world of the 1990s, which is basically when Mandarins of the Future was composed and conceived, doesn't exist anymore. We're living in a world in which the polycrisis, as we nowadays call it, has become much, much more intensified. The institutional rot is much worse. Neoliberalism has become a much more powerful and corrosive force even than it was in the 1990s. Obviously, the climate change crisis has become, the Grim Reaper's at the door now, right? In the 1990s, this was something that was going to happen 25, 30, 50 years from now. That we're now there, right? I mean, Los Angeles is burning down. So my set, and then in addition to that, frankly, I've just kind of become much more, because of 25 years of work experience working in, with high level and in high level organizations, much more attuned to the practicalities of the way in which both institutional and radical change doesn't take place. And so I think all of those things contributed to where I've landed for Children of a Modest Star and this planetary program in general. So that's one trajectory. The other thing I would say is that there's another way to think of my own personal arc on this, which is that I did another book, which you may not have seen because it didn't make that much waves, but it was actually I thought a really fun and interesting book called Deviant Globalization, which was basically a synthesis of a lot of the work I was doing, much of which was classified back in the late aughts and early teens on illicit markets and globalized illicit markets. And one way to think about the transition for me from Mandarins of the Future to Deviant Globalization to Children of a Modest Star is that the first one was about the past, the second one was about the present, and the next one's about the future. And then the last thing I would say is that another whole dimension of my career is when I was working at that consultancy where our clients were in DC, the methodologies we were using were all sort of futurist and foresight methodologies. And in fact, the new book I'm working on now is probably going to be a kind of a history of those methodologies, kind of an intellectual history of those methodologies. And so I've gotten much deeper into the practice of how do you make claims about the future that people will find compelling for justifying action in the present, right? There's big literature that you probably, all of us know a little bit about it, and some of us know, but it's an enormous literature about the way in which claims making about the past is used to justify political action in the present, right? Whether it's, Hobsbawm's invented traditions or, Benedict Anderson's imagined communities or whatever it is, right? Like there are these claims making about who the we are and the continuity of us politically. So there's a huge literature about that. But what's really interesting, is there's also a large amount of claims making about the future that's used to justify political action in the present, whether that's, the doctrine of preemption under George Bush, right? We don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud, to use that, phrase that Condi Rice famously used, or it's, the hockey stick graph, right? In climate change that says, we got to do something so that we don't end up here, right? Or economic forecasting being used as a way to justify jiggering interest rates by central banks, right? These are all claims about the future that are used to justify politically salient action in the present, right? And what I find very curious about is the warrant that any of these claims have. And so that is the subject of my next book. But it's related to Children of Modest Star in the following specific sense, which is that one of the things I've learned from the historical record, studying it and participating in it to some extent and living through it, is that when there's a crisis, there's a famous phrase, and there's a book by the title, Don't Let a Crisis Go to Waste, Never Let a Crisis Go to Waste, right? In a moment of crisis, there's an opportunity for not just incremental or step change, but for radical change, right? The Great War and the Second World War produced the possibility for at least a quasi-functional league and then United Nations, right? That proposal had been around for over a century before the Great War. And it usually requires a crisis. Institutions are by definition sort of conservative, and they're oriented towards the problems they were set up initially to solve. And then they calcify around those things and, don't want to focus on things that they're not capable of. But then when a rupture of some sort happens, all of a sudden possibility space opens up. And what my big lesson of that is that the people who've got a plan, even if it's a bad plan, have a huge advantage over the people who have no plan. Mm-hmm. And the test on that actually is the cases where really bad policy decisions are made, right? So the example I always like to give, precisely because it's such an ugly example, is what happened in the United States in the days after 9/11. So 9/11 happens. It's a moment of rupture, clearly. I mean, I remember the conversation I had with my brother that afternoon, that as bad as this is, the downstream effects of this, the decisions and actions that are going to be taken downstream from this are going to be so much more horrifically bad than what already has taken place this morning. I didn't know what they were, but it was obvious that terrible things were going to happen in the aftermath of that, right? But we now know, because it's been documented, that what happened in the days after 9/11, the week after 9/11, is that George Bush was a kind of callow guy, didn't know very much about foreign policy, but he was a pretty shrewd politician, still the only Republican since the end of the Cold War to win an outright majority of the popular vote in 2004. He had his senior staff come into the Oval Office in the days after 9/11. Every president, if it had been President Gore instead, he would have gone after bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, obviously. Any president would have done that. But the choice to go after Iraq is a much more interesting one. And, this has been, what I'm about to tell you, has been heavily documented by historians and by Bob Woodward and people like this. First person he had into his office was his national security advisor, Condi Rice. What should we do, Condi? She's like, go after Al-Qaeda. He's like, well, that's not enough. We need to do something more. She's like, and he brings the Secretary of State in. She says, what should we do, Colin? And Colin says, we should go after Al-Qaeda. He says, of course we should do that. What else should we do? He goes, then he brings in Paul Wolfowitz and Don Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, and they say, go after Al-Qaeda, but they don't even wait for the second question. They're like, well, let's go after Saddam Hussein too, right? And here's the plan. We wrote it back in 1998. Project for a New American Century, transformation of the Middle East. And that's what he decided to do, because that was the only plan that was available by his senior staff. And the proof that having a plan and a vision of the future being enormously compelling in a moment of crisis is borne out particularly by how bad that decision was, right? Because a terrible vision with bad ideas beat. Doing nothing would have been much better than invading Iraq, right? Well, we don't know that because it's counterfactual, but I feel fairly confident making that claim. I think most people would probably agree with it at this point, right? And yet we went with that plan because a plan, even a bad plan, is better than no plan, right? And the point that I think that for me, I look at and this is a continuity in the arc of a career of thinking about these things, is that the reason why I wrote this book, which, a lot of people have said, well, there's a little bit of a hand wave and magical thinking at the end of the book. And, I don't deny that, actually. I don't know how we're going to get there. What I do know is that if we don't build these kinds of institutions, that there will be a crisis that is horrible on the scale of 9/11 or the Great War or whatever is inevitable. And then things will massively change. And then having at least begun to build a blueprint of what an alternative could look like could be a decisive thing going forward. So I guess that's my kind of take about why would I write something that is, frankly, I don't know if utopian is the right word, but like, at least unmoored from like, what's the legislation tomorrow kinds of practical questions.
Super interesting. And I think a really great way of thinking about all of these things. I mean, one of the things that really struck in my mind from the summit as well was in Holly's session towards the end. She said, she's been doing research in sort of rural communities in America, and she said, she kind of looked out of the audience and said, you have to realize that this is exactly what those rural communities are afraid of. Like, this is what they think is happening, but they think that there are these like nefarious sort of, whatever, vaccine related or geoengineering related sort of projects being cooked up by a sort of shadowy technocratic elite. And I think what I was interested in, I guess, is there are two kind of strands, which I suppose were in your answer as well. I mean, the Berggruen as an institution outside of is interesting and provocative as an institution that is sort of academic, technocratic, however one might think about it, outside of the usual structures in which this sort of thought tends to emerge. But then also the idea of the planetary seems to me to also be an attempt to sit outside of or jump outside of a kind of standard narrative of the global. But I mean, I guess if you see what I mean, I'm trying to sort of thread these two things together. I mean, how do you think about that?
A couple of things on this. First of all, I think, I've gotten quite a lot of pushback on the term planetary. In fact, I just had lunch the other day with Jane Harman, who used to run the Intelligence Committee for the House of Representatives of the United States for many years, very powerful person in the defense and intel community. And she said, I love the idea, but I hate the term. I'm like, well, what, you have a better one? And she doesn't come up with anything. I think that maybe the term planetary, it can come off with a little bit of woo-woo, I guess, and it's woo-woo adjacent, perhaps. I also think that, the term globalization or global actually itself has an interesting intellectual history without getting into all of it. But the initial term that was used sort of in the 70s and 80s were things like interdependence and transnational and stuff like that, more than global or globalization. And when globalization, the term first started to get used in the late 80s, first appearance in the New York Times was in 1985. There were a lot of people who were kind of didn't like it. They thought it sounded weird and jargony. And I just think that's really a question of familiarity. Like if the term takes off, then it won't seem weird anymore, sort of by definition. So, whether it will or not, we'll see. I'm not that wedded to the term. I'm more interested in promoting the concept, the debate over these things in any event. So that's what I would say sort of about the terminology. I think the distinction is clear enough. Whenever I explain, people don't really have a hard time grasping that, there's the globalization of things that humans move intentionally, like trade, goods, ideas, money, services, stuff like that we're intentionally moving. And there's the stuff that we're perturbing that are flowing around the globe, but that are biogeochemical processes that don't, that are not a product of human intention and will, right? Like, the viruses, the space junk, the oceanic plastics, the nitrogen and blooms, and so on and so forth. And people sort of get the distinction. I don't think it's a conceptually that difficult distinction. I think where people maybe get a little bit more hung up is the idea that the institutions that were basically designed to deal with global issues just are simply, in our estimation, not fit for purpose to deal with the planetary issues. I think that step people are still struggling with a little bit more. So that's sort of at the technocratic and elite kind of, that's at the conceptual level. The second thing that you brought up that I think is really important I want to talk about is, the relation between the technocratic and populist, I guess, is the opposite of technocratic or whatever the counter concept is. So look, the theory of change we have at the Berggruen Institute is an unquestionably elite theory of change, right? And this goes to a larger, for me anyways, set of reflections I have. It partly comes out of Mandarins of the Future, actually. So I've been thinking about it for at least that long, which is that systemic change, typically, my read, comes from one of two places within a network, a system. And actually, real change usually happens through some combination of these. So you can either think of it hierarchically, elites versus populist. Usually real change happens because there's some combination of elite motivation and grassroots motivation, right? There's, social movement plus, lawyers writing laws, right? The American Civil Rights Movement is a classic example, right? You have Thurgood Marshall working through the legal system trying to get to Brown versus Board of Education, 20-year legal campaign, and you have Martin Luther King, right, leading the March on Washington, right? And so it's the combination of those things that actually leads eventually to real change. So that's sort of a top-down, bottoms-up thing. There's also an inside-outside thing that I think is not discussed as much, but I think is interesting. There's a center-periphery way of thinking about things. There's people in any given system that are at the center of power. Because they're at the center of power, they have the opportunity to really shake things up, right? I mean, they have at least access to the levers of the way the system works. Trump is now at the heart of the system. If he really wants to change things, he doesn't have full control of the totality of causality. He only has a fraction of the total causality, but he's got a lot of power, right? So people who are at the center of the power structure have a lot of power to change that power structure. The other place that change sometimes comes from is from the distant periphery, edges, right? You think about cultural ideas, right? Probably the most influential musical movement of the last half century, I would argue, is the rise of hip hop, right? Hip hop comes out of the roiling social dysfunctions of Brooklyn and the Bronx in the 1970s, right? It's not happening in Hollywood or in London or, in Nashville, right? But the most, something really profoundly interesting is happening there that ramifies out into all of those other places, right? Now you get hip hop all over the world in every language and so on and so forth. And it starts in the burning South Bronx of the 1970s. And so sometimes it's things at the periphery that can drive change, ideas that are happening in marginal places that come into the center. So I think change can come from both directions. And I think, in fact, real profound change typically happens when there's some combination of top-down, bottoms-up, and inside-outside game, right? So, why is Trump so disruptive? It's not just because he's taking control. It's because there's also a MAGA movement, which was a bunch of marginalized, fragmented groups of people, my joke about this is Facebook promised us initially that, every isolated gay kid in every small town would find the next isolated gay kid in the next small town to be able to form a community. Well, that was true. There's also every previously isolated Nazi in every small town also found the Nazi next door, and they created communities too, right? So, and I think that this actually raises another issue, which is technology also enables new kinds of ways in which these top-down, bottoms-up things will connect to each other, and the inside-outside game will be played next to each other.
And I guess to slightly, is the Institute, the way in which you think about the Institute as a kind of specific institution of itself, and the way in which you've put it together, or it's been put together, is that also trying to kind of push, how is its kind of form, its makeup, trying to bring these things together, I suppose?
Right. Look, so our contribution to these changes it's an elite theory of change, right? So it's about trying to affect the power centers. It's about, trying to, generate large ideas at elite institutions and then push those things out. That's what our intervention is. That's not to say that we think that that's the only kind of intervention that matters. As I say, I'm fully cognizant and supportive of the idea that we need a social movement. If the planetary is to actually change things, we're going to need to create planetary politics, planetary constituencies, planetary ways of thinking that are at the grassroots level, right? And so, that's just not where we personally play. When I see people who are doing things like that, though, I am 100% supportive, believe in that. And part of the argument we make about subsidiarity is I think if we do the restructuring of authorities in the way that we're describing, it actually hopefully will generate more possibilities for grassroots excitement about this, because you're going to be giving more power at local and smaller units that will allow people to feel like they're not disempowered, but they're actually empowered to participate in these things. So actually, while the structural change probably has to happen through some sort of an elite-driven process, because you've got to have somebody writing laws about who has authority over what in what places, right? If you do it right, it actually enables a new kind of popular participation, democratic participation, inclusion in new ways. And so I'm interested in reforms that, to our processes of politics, that can enable a new kind of, hopefully, healthy political engagement.
Yeah, I think it was interesting. Actually, it strikes me that, I mean, I hadn't known this, but in the conversation that you had at the Berggruen Institute, you mentioned the project that you're doing with Anne-Marie Slaughter in terms of like really getting into like a really kind of nitty gritty, like how do we actually put together actual, because I think sometimes these conversations can feel like they're very much happening at an abstract level. So like it's interesting to the way bringing those two things together.
Right. So yeah, I mean, the collaboration we're going to be doing with Anne-Marie, I think, is like a classic example. It's an elite theory of change, right? In the sense that like what we're going to do is write model curricula, reach out to our friends at the top 10 or so, I don't know, maybe it'll be 15, international relations and public policy schools, and try to get them to institutionalize the teaching of these kinds of ideas as a baseline assumption. And again, like this seems like, whoa, that's a really weirdly ambitious thing to want to do. And why would they want to do that? But there's a specific historical antecedent to this, which is in the 1970s, right? This exact same thing was done in the training of diplomats and people in public policy schools with respect to economics. Prior to the 1970s, and as part of the neoliberal turn, right? Like all of a sudden we need to assess everything. One of the hallmarks of the arrival of neoliberalism is the ascendancy of econometric ways of doing assessment, right? Cost-benefit analysis, thinking about trade implications. And all of a sudden, by the 1980s, it was just expected that if you were a practitioner of international affairs, you need to have a certain baseline literacy in the way in which the international financial system works, in the way in which international trade works. You need to have some at least like sort of Econ 2 level understanding of both macroeconomics and microeconomics. And if you didn't have those things, you were kind of, in the early 1970s, Henry Kissinger used to boast about how he knew nothing about economics, right? That's an inconceivable thing for a foreign minister to do today. I mean, some of them may be ignorant, but like they're not going to boast about being ignorant, right? And I think, and that was changed. And it was changed through an intentional strategy of saying everybody needs to understand this. We're living in a world of massive economic interdependence. That everybody who's participating in global affairs needs to have some baseline understanding of these things. And I think we're moving to the same era. The coming of the planetary as a phenomenon means everybody needs to have some baseline literacy about what the nature of the challenges are with respect to pandemics, with respect to climate change, with respect to managing the global commons. I mean, these are all things that I think people are going to need to have some baseline literacy on. And so we're trying to drive change. Now, this again, it is an elite-driven top-down model that we're choosing. But as far as I'm concerned, somebody should be doing this for fourth graders too.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's just not the role we're taking on.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.